Anyway, welcome to Community Night, and we have a special program tonight. Our long-time center practitioner, David Cunningham, sitting over here, is going to give us an account of an awakening he had in the fall of 2016. And actually, David and I went over some dates here, and I'm going to give you a little background because some of you don't know David. But he's really one of my oldest students. Back in about 1988 or 89, he was living in LA, and he went to the Bodhi Tree bookstore where I used to work, and he asked them, did they have any books by Western mystics? And somebody had remembered me, a clerk there or whatever, and gave him a copy of my book, Naked Through the Gate, which had just been published, and we just sent a couple of copies down to the Bodhi Tree. Oh, wow. And yeah, so you may be one of the first people to ever read it. You're probably the first person to ever buy it from a store. In any case, he read it, and he wrote me a letter, and I wrote him back, and we had maybe exchanged a few letters, and then in 1990, he came to Eugene for a person-to-person visit, and we had a good talk then, and I think you stayed for a Sunday program or something.
I don't remember about that trip.
But anyway, we made personal contact. Yeah. And then at that point, somewhere around there, David and his wife Bailey, who's with us here, moved up to Anacortes, Washington. And in 1994, he started coming on retreats. We were having a Cloud Mountain at the time. And he estimates about 30-something retreats between 1994 and 2013, something around there, right? Also, David and Bailey hosted Jennifer and me coming up to Anacortes for a couple of little weekend, 3-day mini retreats. I think it was 1998 and 1999. They very graciously put us up at their house and then had a bunch of people over, and we had a little kind of seminar kinds of things with meditation. So, and then we corresponded over this period of time. Every once in a while, they would write me a letter about what's going on in his path, and then we'd set up a time to talk. And he'd call me on a Sunday afternoon, and we'd have a conversation. So he really had a sort of a correspondence course relationship with us. I think he might be the only person in the world who ever woke up as a result of a correspondence course. That might be another first for you.
The internet happens all the time.
Yeah, right. In any case.
I never quite thought about it like that.
I didn't either until just when I was assembling these notes. So in any case, after his awakening in 2016, he contacted me. I think you sent me actually a written account at one point, a letter. And then we talked a few times, and over the year or so since then, we've talked some more. And I'm convinced he's had a genuine awakening and a transformative awakening. And by that, I mean not just a little glimpse, but something that's really transformed his life. So I invited him after this sort of test period to come down here and give us an account of his awakening, and so which he's going to do in a minute. And I must say, generally when this happens, then if you guys want the person to be a teacher, then they become a teacher at the center. I don't know what our formal relationship with David's going to be after this, if any, since he still lives in Anacortes. He's not about to move down here, and it's a good thing. We have a lot of teachers down here. We don't have any in Anacortes. But we may have some sort of informal relationship, but that's really not so important. We've talked about the teachings, and he doesn't disagree with any of our teachings, which is important. And I would certainly recommend him as a teacher to anybody who's interested in mystical path, whether they're associated with the center or not. And maybe just this being posted on the internet will let people know that he's available, maybe people in that area. If you know people in that area of Anacortes, or how far, like Seattle, is that too?
Seattle's about 70, 80 miles south, so
Okay.
it's about an hour and a half drive.
Well, it's doable anyway.
Yeah.
We'll see what happens. We don't know. It'll grow organically. So with that recommendation, I will turn this over to you, and you can tell us your background, the highlights of your path, what your awakening was like, and maybe mention a few things, what's happened in life after awakening.
Okay.
Can you stand up for this?
I think so. Yeah.
We can all get out of your way here.
So hi everybody. I see some faces I recognize and a fair number I don't. So with that introduction, I'm going to just fill in a few in-between spaces. I'm going to go back to the beginning, sort of my life, and tell you that I got interested in spiritual things at a relatively pretty early age. And I think a lot of that was because my home life, my family life when I was a kid, was very disrupted by a parent's divorce and all the things that happened around that. And it led to a source of a real emptiness or a hole in my life. And like I think a lot of us, you know, something happens that just makes you go, this doesn't feel right. This is not working. My family was pretty well off financially. We had a lot of the stuff that, you know, you're told in America you need to have to make you happy. And I wasn't. And so I knew at a kind of early age that the so-called dream wasn't true. And that made me think, I don't feel right. I don't believe the dream. There's got to be something else. I don't know what it is. And I started looking. And one day around age 15 or 16, I had a guitar teacher and he was into different things. And he said to me at one point, you know, I think you might want to read this book. This is pretty interesting, because we'd chatted a little bit about things. And it was Paramahansa Yogananda's autobiography of a yogi. And I said, okay. And I picked that up and I read it and I understood maybe 10% of it or something. A lot of it just completely escaped me, but I was sort of awestruck. And it gave me this idea that there is something that our culture back then in the, I don't know, late 60s, early 70s didn't really talk much about, maybe didn't even acknowledge that there was some other approach to life that might bring some happiness in a different way. So I got interested and started reading other things I could find at the time. I ended up reading Carlos Castaneda and other things that were current at the time, Ram Dass and stuff. And time went by, and when I was about 17 years old, I had my last year of high school was in an alternative school. And I had a guy who was a teacher in a yoga class that I was in. He was a student in that class, and he was a teacher of another class I took. And we started talking, and he had become a fan of an Indian guru who was around at that time, Swami Muktananda. I don't know if any of you have heard of him, but and he and I talked and got sort of close. And one day he said, well, this was in Southern California, Los Angeles, where I grew up. And he said, well, there's a retreat going on in the Bay Area, and I'm going to drive up there and go to it. It's just a weekend or something. Think about whether you want to come. And I did. And I was completely unprepared for it in just about every way. There's a lot of Hindu tradition, you know, bowing before the teacher, head on the floor, all sorts of things I didn't know anything about or understand. And sitting for 2 days of meditation for the first time in my life at 17, you know, I wasn't really well prepared for that. So, but nonetheless, it made a big impression on me. And my teacher, Tim, and I kept talking about it after the weekend. And he kept going on retreats. And I finished my senior year of high school. And Swami Muktananda was going to New York, to the Catskill Mountains, where they had a retreat center. And I was able to put together enough money to go and spend the summer there. So I lived at the ashram, worked, you know, cleaned dishes, did yard work, whatever. And did all the meditation and the retreats, and they had a lot of pretty intensive things. Spent the summer doing that, came back home, started college. In college, in the town where I went to school, Santa Cruz, there were a lot of things. Yeah, if you've been there, you know what I mean. And there were teachers in town at the time that nobody really heard about unless they ran into them. But they were really profoundly influential for me. I spent a lot of time around them for a couple of years. They sort of gradually caused me to sway away from Swami Muktananda because I thought they were the same in terms of talking about enlightenment and seemed to be able to, I don't know. I believed that they were enlightened, and they were talking about it to me in English, and I didn't have to go through all the cultural idioms of Hinduism and guru worship and all that stuff. And after a period of time, I found that really attractive. And that went on for a period of a few years, and then ended up moving out of Santa Cruz down to San Diego, back to LA, where Bailey and I met. And one day, the event occurred that you just described. I had lost touch with teachers at that point. And I walked into this Bodhi Tree bookstore where Joel had worked, and I asked the guy the question, you know. And he gave me a copy of Naked Through the Gate, perhaps the first, first one that was sold. And it just really blew me away. It was a story of somebody I felt I could relate to. He was from my culture. He spoke my language. He's a contemporary, roughly, you know. And he lived a life I could really relate to. He wasn't from the Himalayas, you know, wearing robes and all this stuff. And that was just really inspirational to me. And the story, I loved the story. I mean, I could really relate to it. So we wrote the letters and all that stuff. And in 1990, we moved from LA to Anacortes, Washington. And late May, early June of 90, I was headed back to the Bay Area for a short, brief family get-together in the Bay Area. And I called him and asked if we could meet and just chat for a little bit on my way down. And we did. And one of the most important things he said to me at that meeting, right off the bat, was we were talking about no self and selflessness and all this stuff, which of course I had no real understanding of. And he asked me a question that I realized subsequently drove the next 26 years of my path. And that question was, where's the boundary between you and me? And he was sitting on a couch and I was on a chair opposite, and the question just stupefied me. I mean, I had no idea even what it meant, much less how to answer it. I remember holding up my arm and going, well, I don't know. And he sort of giggled and said, what, your skin or something? I said, well, I had no clue. Like I said, that question arose later and proved to be really powerful. So anyway, fast forward 3 years, we had seen and met that one time, and I didn't see him again until December of 93, when my life was sort of in a shambles. I'd lost a job. Well, I had been a contract programmer, and the contract ran out, and I didn't find any other really good work. I felt at that point in time like my spiritual path had just completely run aground, and I was sort of aimless. And Bailey and I and a friend of ours met for lunch at our local restaurant, and I was sort of, oh, woe is me, moaning and all that stuff. And at one point she looked at me and said, you know, you've known all these teachers over time. Why don't you call one of them? You know, know this guy here, and there's that guy Joel down in Eugene. And, why don't you call him or something and just sort of say, help? And so I did, and asked if I could come down and meet him again. And I said, remember I stopped by 3 years ago and we spent an hour or two talking or something. He said, sure, come on down. So I came down for a weekend. We talked at some length on a Saturday, and then maybe again on Sunday too, I think, and I might have stayed for the Sunday program. And when I left, I knew I'd found my teacher. And that was the beginning. So that was December of '93, and the first retreat I went to was fall of '94. In between, the correspondence began, me asking for help about this or that, and I don't understand this or that, and all that kind of stuff, and reporting whatever experiences I had. And first retreat, as I said, in '94, and then anywhere from 1 to 3 retreats pretty much every year thereafter until 2013. I want to make a slight digression here to mention something not immediately related, but at one point in this process, in like 2001, I started to feel like I'd sort of run aground again in a different way, but I recognized, especially from some of our conversations, that I was just way too in my head about the teachings and the practices and everything related to that. And I didn't know how to stop that, how to get unstuck there. And I had no idea what to do about that. But I have learned over the years that every once in a while this flash of intuition will strike that says, do this. And I got one of those, and it was to start practicing Tai Chi. And Bailey had known a Tai Chi teacher from the time she was in LA years ago, and we had met. And he has now been practicing for 50 plus years, some of that time with one of the greats in modern history. And she said, after I spent some time looking around, not finding anybody, she said, why don't you go see him? So I did, and we started. And I've been doing that now for 17 years as well. And that proved pivotal because it proved to be something that helped me get out of my head and understand the teachings in a really different way. There's an exercise you do in Tai Chi called push hands, where you go back and forth with a partner and you're trying to be very subtle and yet move your partner from their fixed step position. And when you're working with somebody with 40 or 50 years experience and you've got 1 or 2 and you're just completely lame, you've got a steep learning curve ahead. And I did, but 2, 3, 4 years into it, I started, really quickly, I recognized he's saying do one thing and I'm doing something really different. And I don't know how to stop that. And this is where the parallels with the spiritual path really started to become prominent for me. And the way I learned to stop it was by thousands and thousands of repetitions. We just kept practicing over and over and over. And we'd meet privately once a week and work for an hour and a half. And you can get a lot of repetitions in an hour and a half just going back and forth and back and forth. And so hundreds and hundreds of times he'd say, did you see that mistake? Did you see that mistake? And it can be a really humbling experience, but on the other hand, it's a gift. And I really felt like it was a gift. And eventually it taught me how to pay attention to sensation, right? I mean, we talk about the fields of awareness a lot. Sight, sound, thought, etc. I had no problem paying attention to thought, but I had a lot of problem getting out of my head into any other of the fields. And when you're working with somebody with a lot of experience and they can show you how your attention's lagging because he started to do X and I went Y, you're going that way, backwards. And it becomes obvious I'm missing something. I don't know what I'm missing, but I know I'm missing something because I'm going that way. And over the course of years, what happened was I learned to pay attention to sensation without getting stuck in my head, without thinking he's doing this, so I should do that. But it took thousands of repetitions to do. And it proved vital in my spiritual path. It was the ability to attend to arising experience and just watch it without having thought jump in and attempt to manipulate it, understand it, fill in the blank. So that was one thing that actually proved really important for me. So fast forward to about 2013, and I continued to go on retreat. And I was packed and ready to go to the 2013 fall retreat. And I get a phone call, and my mother had died. So that canceled that retreat. Oh, excuse me, I need to back up for a minute. Prior to that, at each retreat, especially for people who don't live in Eugene, Joel would try and meet with you privately at least once to just talk about how things were going and all that stuff. And we used to do that every retreat. In the last 3, 4, 5 retreats up to 2013, we had talked, and Joel had listened and nodded and smiled and said a little thing or two. But what he was saying decreased each of those meetings. And at the last 1 or 2 or 3 or something, he said, you've pretty much heard everything I have to say. I mean, it's kind of up to you at this point. You either do it or, I'm happy to talk to you, but I don't have anything new to say. And that caused me some distress, honestly. Each of those times. And I really started to think about it, and I didn't know really what to make of it or how or anything. And then 2013 happened. My mother died, can't go to retreat, got to deal with this. And then after that, some work issue arose, and then somebody else's health issues arose. And the short version of the story, I couldn't go to the next 3 or 4 years worth of retreats. And sometime into that period, I sort of thought, Joel basically told me, you're on your own. You know what you need to know. Now you just have to apply. And I thought the universe very craftily arranged to make it me unable to go and continue to lean on him. And I really started thinking, it kind of makes some sense. I mean, he said, up to you. And so the universe sort of said, well, we're going to make it impossible for you to lean on him or the center or the retreats. You're on your own now. It's like, okay. And that was kind of scary, but I had no choice. So I did. I sort of buckled down. And one of the things that included was I memorized the instructions for effortless contemplation, which is the last page of Way of Selflessness. It's the very last thing in the book before the notes and all that stuff. And I would go on walks and repeat it to myself as I'm walking. But especially the first stanza. The first stanza, the first time I read it, just almost took my breath away. And I knew there was something really important there for me, but I did not know what that was. One day in 2014, I'm walking and repeating it to myself, that first stanza, which goes something like, without, how does that go? I had it printed up and I don't have it in front of me. Basically, without making any modifications to what's going on right now, just consider this. Is there consciousness of sights? Is there consciousness of sounds? Is there consciousness of sensations? Is there consciousness of desires, aversions, emotions? Is there consciousness of thought? This very consciousness, which is here right now, is that divine luminous reality you have been striving to realize all along. However, since that consciousness is already here, your striving is unnecessary. And that day on that walk, at that moment when that last word went through my head, it was like somebody hit me with a sledgehammer. And I became furious with myself. I mean, just practically a rage, because I realized what I had just repeated. It said, this consciousness right now as it is what you're looking for. And I'm thinking, what the hell are you doing? You have spent 40 years looking for altered states, highs, divine bliss, divine knowledge, yada, 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 fill in the blank. Despite knowing the teachings, I realized this is just complete BS. And that anger became like a gasoline that was poured on a fire. And I realize now the question from 20-some years earlier, where's the boundary, really became the guide. He wrote, it's this very consciousness right now. And all these retreats and teachings later, I knew intellectually that what the boundary was this idea of a self. So I just, okay, rather than looking for all this other stuff, I'm going to try and find the self that I'm so damn sure exists. That's the boundary. And the only way I could figure to do it was to use the guidelines of sights, sounds, sensations, etc. I mean, the things that actually arose in experience from moment to moment. And to just ask of every one of them, is that me? Is that thought me? Is that sensation of my foot hitting the ground me? Is that thought me? And the obvious answer every time was no. It can't be, because it's gone, and you're still here. And for the next 2 years, whether I was sitting in meditation or walking or at work or going to sleep or whatever, I was engaged in this constantly. Subsequently, I know what I was doing was destroying every image of something that came to mind that could have been a self. And one day, 2 years later, I don't even know the day, but it was, let's say, September of 16. I was walking on the same beach that the earlier event occurred on, and doing exactly what I said, is walking and say I was paying attention to one step and then the next and the next. And one step, one foot hit the ground. Is that me, the sensation? And before the next step, the next foot touched the ground, it was like attention just collapsed inwardly, like it was sucked into a black hole. And there was just an instant recognition. And then a few seconds later, thoughts came up that said, it can't be. There is no such thing. There never was. Those were the words, the thoughts that were attached. But I was, there's just vast, wide open, empty space. There is no such thing as a self. It's just, pardon me, mind-numbingly obvious. Any notion of such a thing just seemed laughable. And I was laughing out loud. Luckily, I was on the beach by myself, because I'm sure I would have looked like an idiot. But that's also kind of how I felt. It's like, this is so obvious. How could I have spent the last 42 years missing this. But I did. And at that moment, that just seemed like the funniest joke the universe could possibly be playing. And basically, that's the end of that story. It's all a big nothing. And that was now a little over a year and a half ago. And what's changed basically is also nothing. It's just something you thought was there, you see wasn't. I love the snake in the rope metaphor. It actually happened to me one day. I was walking in the wilderness, and I already knew the story, the snake in the rope. And I turned a corner, and I literally jumped backwards a couple of feet because there was a pretty good-sized snake on the path in front of me. And I started, oh, God, what am I going to do? Am I going to go around? I can't see a way around it really conveniently. I go back. It's a long way back. And I looked at the snake, and then I just busted out laughing because it was a rope. And self is the same. It's an appearance of something that doesn't actually exist. Looking for the boundary between you and me, or me and you, or anything and anything. If you actually look for something in your experience, you just don't find it. And I don't know how many thousands of times you have to do that before your belief that such a thing exists just collapses. I could tell you about the purple polka dot unicorn that appears on the 27th Thursday of the month, and you're going to look at me like, okay, have you been taking your meds? But that's not so different, right? I mean, if the thing isn't there, it just isn't there. It's a convenient pointer for us to use in common day-to-day stuff. But anyway, that's probably more or less it. Yeah.
Very good.
Am I forgetting anything? She's supposed to be prompting me. Nothing of significance? So, yeah.
So if you have any questions, ready for questions?
Yes.
Don't sit down.
No.
Don't sit down. You're not done yet. This is at the beginning, let me tell you. Now the hell begins.
Now, did you say there was a period of time between when Joel's words struck you like a sledgehammer and when you stepped in the black hole? Was that like a 2-year period?
Yes. And what happened in that 2-year period was, it was sort of like, I recognized that this is my own subjective way of talking to myself at that point. You idiot, what have you been doing? This is what it says. How many times have you read this? You've memorized it. It's pointing to now. It's pointing to present moment experience. Not what do you think about it, not that. It's a sound arises and passes. Okay, so does a sight, etc. So yeah, it was like I had to scrap everything. Subjectively, it was like that moment burned down my entire practice.
The sledgehammer moment?
Yeah, yeah. And all that was left was constant inquiry, and even meditation, which I did continue to practice, was just a more concentrated form of that. It was sort of like anything else. I don't really know how to say it, but it burned up in that moment. It was like, I remember thinking at the time, you are done, boy. You have spent 40 years at this point in some form of practice or another. And you have, in some way or another, pardon me, bullshitted about a whole lot of it. And now, this is the most rigorously honest thing you can do, is just look at each instant of experience and say, what is that? Does that prove this self you believe in, or does it not? So, yeah. Yeah.
So David, what kind of practice did you have throughout this time? Like daily meditation?
Yes. Yeah, daily meditation at least a couple times. Well, let me back up. What time are you talking about?
Well,
At the end or through?
kind of throughout.
Throughout, I meditated generally at least twice a day. I don't know, 20 minutes, half an hour each time. I did the precepts, fundamentals, sort of the whole shooting match. Pardon me, went on retreats, like I said, a couple times a year, most years. Occasional correspondence, I sort of journaled, all the typical kinds of things, I think. Different times I did mantra practice. Interestingly, up until that moment of sort of running into the wall at high speed, I had never really found a form of inquiry that just rang my bell. It's like, who am I? I don't know, it just never quite clicked for me. I think because it sort of presupposed there was an I there that I have to find an answer for. I had to get even more primitive and just look, okay, this experience is arising right now. Is that me? And getting that primitive was really helpful for me because whatever it was would go, right? I mean, I can see this hand and now I can't. So I'm still here. So that isn't me. So 2 years of subjecting everything that arose in my experience to that kind of inquiry. I think I didn't realize it at the time, but it's like a story I've heard you tell on retreat before, where it's just, say there's this giant brick wall you're trying to get over, around, or through, or whatever, and it's too big to go over and too long to go around, and so all you can do is start pulling out bricks one by one. And you never know when it's going to happen, but there might come a time when you pull out one brick and the whole wall comes down. And that's kind of how I think about it. Or another one of my favorite analogies is somebody once asked Michelangelo, how did you make the statue of David? You guys know that? How did you make that statue of David, which is, I don't know, that tall and huge and an amazing piece of sculpture, out of a block of marble? And his answer was easy. I just chipped away everything that wasn't David. Right? Turns out now there's nothing left but space. Yes?
How did your inquiry practice affect your functioning in the rest of your life? Like, did you have to take a break from it in order to, like, go to work or deal with certain kinds of stuff?
I didn't have to take a break from it. I mean, there were times still have a pretty demanding job. I'm a county election supervisor, and that's demanding. And what I found was I couldn't do inquiry constantly throughout the course of the day because I had to direct my attention to whatever needed attention. But what I could do was just periodically, throughout an hour or whatever, I could just notice, say, for example, an emotion had arisen, like my guts had cinched up a little bit because, oh God, here's a deadline coming and we're not ready. And then I could just stop for a second, take a breath, notice the sensation, notice the thought, watch them to pass. Is that me? Answer is obvious, right? I'm still here. And in fact, practice under those kinds of conditions was in many ways more powerful. Because it's a quote unquote real world situation where you're responsible for X or Y or Z and you can't space out and you can't sit down and contemplate. It's just deal with the immediate phenomena. There it is, it's gone, boom, next. I couldn't indulge in lots of intellectual speculation about it. Just notice, is it here? No, it's gone. It wasn't here a minute ago, then it was, and now it's gone. That obviously is not me.
Okay, so Paul,
Please.
how do you deal with the person who's asking that question? Like,
I didn't. I think that's a great question, and my answer is I didn't. Because by that point in time, I'd had enough experience with this that, at least the way I thought about it at that moment was, that's just a thought. in this case, of another thought. Who's the person who's doing this? Well, that's a thought. So what I would do would be, I'd say, okay, is that thought me? Is that thought of that question me? And I'd watch, and it would also go, well, nope, can't be. I didn't presuppose that there was such a thing, the person who's asking that question. Which was great because it meant everything was fair game. You know what I mean? Am I making sense?
Totally. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
So did it kind of start out as like a belief that who I am doesn't come and go, so that can't be me? Is that how you got to this? Is that a belief or a...
What was obvious was that awareness was still here. You know, I knew enough of the teachings, at least intellectually, to recognize they were pointing to awareness as being the essence of who and what we are. And there's something about this notion of self that's like an added extra bonus, you know, the one who owns that awareness. Yeah, well, okay. That's what I realized I'm here to explore. Is that really true? I'm sorry, ask your question again. I already got lost in my own rambles.
Well, it seems like you started out with this, it was either a belief or a knowing that
I think
does not come and go. So you...
I think it was a knowing, because there'd been enough retreat work, enough meditation, enough everything, that I was pretty confident awareness was always present. I mean, I could never point to a time when it wasn't. Right? Does that make sense? So, lacking anything else, I just went forward from that point. I mean, that was a given as far as experience, as far as I knew at that moment. And I'll tell you, when this started, I thought to myself, the odds of succeed, I mean, again, remember 40 years of doing this in some form or another, all sorts of different teachings and everything. And it all blew up in one instant. And from that point on, I was sort of both bereft, but sort of marvelously free too. It's like all this BS just fell away, and I felt sort of aimless and lost and kind of free, because there was just a knowing inside. This is the only thing that's left for you to do. It's just fanatically investigate every moment you can of arising and passing experience. Not investigate it in the sense of trying to figure it out, but just notice. It comes and it goes. And to ask myself, is that the boundary between you and me? And I thought, you know, the odds of succeeding at this are about 1,000,000 to 1. But I'm going to die anyway. So, well, what the hell? Just do it. There's nothing else left. You've explored all these nooks and crannies and thought until your head was about to drop off. No more. So there was a sort of knowing underneath, at least, that it's this or nothing. I'm done. I mean, all the rest of it just died in that moment for me. I've often called it my moment of running into a wall at really high speed, and it blew up everything. And that moment felt like shit, but it was one of the most important moments on my path. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. You had a question? Did it?
Yeah, I have two actually.
Yeah.
The first one, there's something you said when you talked about your sort of final moment that reminded me a lot of Annie's report of her final moment. She said, I'm going to paraphrase, I probably can't get the words exactly, but she said, at one point she thought to herself, how can I be completely gone and still completely who I was at the same time? And I remember trying, can you say more about that? And she's like, no, I don't think I can. But I'm hoping you can.
We run into those roadblocks a lot. Familiar with this problem, huh? You know, And I'm reminded, over the last couple of days, I've listened to the talks that both of you gave after your awakening. And I also listened to Luke's, watched his interview. And some crafty guy in the audience asked, what did you attain or acquire or something like that? And I just giggled when I heard that. You get absolutely nothing. I have less than I've ever had before. I don't even have me anymore. And yet, you know, there's this body mind, and I'm aware of it, just I'm aware of that one. Or, you know, you can get really picky with words, and you can try and speak really precisely, but it gets incredibly tedious. You could say there's awareness of a body mind here and of one there. And all that awareness looks like it always did. And there's awareness of thoughts and feelings and sensations. There's just nobody there anymore who owns them. So all that stuff kind of looks the same, but it doesn't belong to anybody anymore. You've often talked about the hurricane metaphor, you know, the winds spinning create the sense, right? Well, my experience, at least so far, is that upon awakening, some of those winds die down really fast. Some of them keep going for a while, and some of them are still going. And I don't know, these folks all have more experience at this game than me. I don't know if all of them ever stop or not. And it kind of doesn't matter because they, again, don't belong to anybody. So did I answer at least one of your questions?
You did. You actually almost completely answered the second one as well, indirectly. So I'm just going to ask it just in case.
Yeah, please.
As you were talking about this inquiry into the self, is this the self? Is this the self? No. When I think about myself, the self that seems to be there, an image that maybe describes it better is like maybe an ice tray or some container that water flows into. And it has a certain shape, and while the water's in it, the water kind of takes that shape. And when the water's gone, the water isn't me, but the container that the content is flowing through seems like me because there's a certain kind of more constant kind of feel to it. Even though the content changes in impermanence, that shape or those qualities or whatever it is that is constantly cycling through, that seems more like a self than any of the content or the specific sensations or whatever. So you sort of already answered it, but just whatever.
So going with your metaphor, what in your experience is the ice cube tray?
That's exactly why I said you've already answered the question. What you were saying before. Yeah, it's just more.
Yeah, and see what happened with me was I just kept asking that question thousands of times. And at some point, and between those two steps, there was not one iota of a shred of an intimation that I was on the verge of anything. Nothing. And the next instant, it's done.
Wow.
And it just so completely awoke in me an understanding and appreciation of what you've always said about that moment. There's nothing you can do to cause it. I had no sense of having done anything that did anything to cause that. It's just sort of thinking about it objectively afterwards. I thought, well, it's likely that all that inquiry had something to do. I mean, it probably disemboweled a belief system, if nothing else.
Dave, I got a question.
Yeah.
So when you asked that, did you ask it and allow spaciousness? Or did you ask it for asking for an answer? Or did you just simply, when I ask or do some of those things, sometimes I've got this grasping for, like, I should make this happen too. I should make an answer. And yet sometimes I could ask it and I'm trying to I'll make spaciousness for myself. Or did you just simply ask it with nothing?
The latter.
But without even trying to have no expectation.
Right. Yeah.
And then pull that from that.
You know, that moment of running into that wall, you know, you may have been, you went outside for a minute, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm not sure if you were here when I described my sort of running into the wall moment. Did you hear that?
No.
Basically, I was walking on the beach. No, it's fine. I was walking on the beach and I was mentally reciting a passage from the instructions for effortless contemplation from the end of The Way of Selflessness. And in repeating that, there was an instant where everything inside came to a crashing halt. And it was like something just sucked the life out of me and my path, except that I was furious at myself for having been such an imbecile for so long and not paying attention to the words that were right there on the page. And that fury, if you will, is what powered that inquiry for the next couple of years. It was just ferociously focused. When I had no expectation of any success, that's an interesting question because when that moment happened, it was like, you're done. You're going to do this because there's nothing else in life for you to do, but, and I think you maybe heard me say it a minute ago, your odds of success are like 1 in a million. So I had no expectation that anything was ever going to happen. And if anything like that had arisen, I would have just sort of watched that and made that also an object of inquiry. Oh, a little sense of a reward coming in the future. What's that? Actually, I started watching closely enough, I'd say, well, there's a little bodily sensation somewhere in the chest or the gut, a little sense of reaching for something, and a little thought niggling in the background there about, ooh. And what's that? Is that me? Wasn't there a second ago. And now it's gone again. Next. It just got really brutally merciless, sort of. I mean, it wasn't like I was enjoying myself.
You're really encouraging these people.
Yeah, I'm trying to, yeah. Well, this is how my teacher sort of affected me.
So would you say that you were surrendered?
Well, I guess looking in retrospect, I'd probably say that that's sort of sensible way to put it. I never thought about it like that. You know, honestly, there was no juice for thinking about that. Do you know what I mean? It's like everything else burned up, except I knew I had to do this. And the rest of it was just fluff, gone. So I didn't think about surrender. I didn't think about devotion. I didn't think about bhakti. All I thought about is this me? And, you know, Bailey, my wife Bailey and I, we've talked a lot about this. And this question, is this me, it doesn't really work for her great. And I think, you know, fine. It was just the weird way I ended up asking a question that could direct my attention to specific phenomena arising and passing. And that is what I think really made a difference. Because, you know, I've been doing this long enough that I knew I didn't want to get caught in thinking about my thinking about my thinking. There's a thought. Watch it come and go. If it's gone and awareness is still here, that ain't me. Didn't matter what it was. You had a question.
Yeah, I wondered if I'd heard you right earlier, and then you did express it the same way with Mark. I was fascinated by your expression, if I heard it right, that there is no self that owns this awareness. I wanted to ask if there was anything more you could elaborate on that. I think you kind of have been. And my next question was how do you lose that central illusion?
You can't.
Oh, you're in trouble, David. You are in trouble.
And I wish I had a more skillful answer. I really do. And that's kind of why I keep going back to like this moment that was so important where it was just sort of like crashing the wall, because it just obliterated all of that. I just realized it had all been coming from ego, for ego. It was like I wasn't like a capitalist, I wasn't a materialist, but hot damn, I'm a spiritual seeker, right? And so you can create that identity out of thousands of things. And I had. And that was kind of the lie I ran into at that moment. And the biggest part of the lie was I had an instruction that I intuitively knew from someplace deep in my gut, just spoke right to me. And I was doing all this other shit. And it was, in that instant of seeing that, it just evaporated. I know that. Does that sound weird? Because, you don't count. Front row here doesn't count. But yeah, I really wish I had a more skillful answer. You can't do it, but what you can do is burn up everything that you can find. Everything you think you are, put it to question. Why do you think that? Is it something you can see coming and going? I mean, is there a moment where you're distracted by something else, and then that thing, whatever it is, isn't present in consciousness? And then you return to how you were before, and that thing is there. Well, could that be you? I mean, is it possible, if something vanishes, that it's still the thing that's present? Right? I mean, that sort of came down to the math, the numbers of it, right? I can't, if awareness is still here, I can't be something that's gone. And getting back to an earlier question, the me that's asking or the me that's watching, at that point, there was no tolerance for that kind of nonsense. It was just, I knew enough to know that that was thought going on about thought, just spinning its own web endlessly. And I had spent decades doing that, so I was really good at it. And so I recognized it. And at that point, I just didn't put up with that. It was just, it didn't fool me anymore. Maybe that's the thing. Pardon?
That's very interesting.
It's like it had always captured my attention as an important thought to have. Oh, well, what about the one who's watching this? What about that? Well, I mean, other than another thought about another thought, what about it? Who cares? Were you?
What would new Dave tell old Dave?
Yeah, we rehearsed this a little bit. Which I think is a great question.
How is New Dave?
And I even wrote out an answer or two, because I think that's a great question. Because the way she really asked it the first time was, what would new Dave say to the old Dave? Because the old Dave is most of us sitting out here in the audience. What would new Dave say to old Dave? Because old Dave is most of us sitting out here in the audience. So, one of my favorite things from one of my new spiritual quote masters is borrowed from Winston Churchill, who said, never, never, never surrender. And I just removed surrender and inserted give up. My life is as normal and pedestrian for this culture at this time in our history as you can find. I'm 61, married, got 2 adult kids. I've worked basically my whole adult life. It just looks as normal can look. I haven't been to the Himalayas. I haven't, gone to Thailand and meditated for years at a retreat center. But I have done what I've described. And all this occurred in that context. And ultimately, it worked, whatever that means. Another thing I would say to the old me is, and I've really only come to appreciate this recently, the path is really about doing, not understanding or trying to figure out anything. In fact, if you're trying to figure out something other than how to do a practice properly, you're probably wasting your time. So pick like your core practices, whatever they are, meditation, inquiry, and learn how to do them right. There's directions, and it's not like you have to be fanatic about it, because sometimes you've got to vary, but stay with it. And if there are teachings that really move something deep inside you, like there was with me with this passage in Instructions for Effortless Contemplation, take the time and trouble to commit it to memory, because then you can carry it with you wherever you are. And whatever you're doing, you can bring that teaching to mind and see, how can I put that into practice in this moment? Okay, here I am at my computer trying to figure out how to get the ballots to the ballot printer on time. Is that a thought? Is it arising? Where is it? It's in awareness. And now it's gone. Next. So I really didn't understand this until late in the game, but doing. The path is about doing, not figuring out anything. If you're really involved in figuring out something, good luck. And lastly, I would say, give it your all. Whatever it is that mobilizes all your resources, find that. Even if it's something that normally we would label negative, especially on a spiritual path, anger's verboten, right? That anger that I felt at that moment and that powered me for 2 more years was critical. It gave me a kind of single-pointed, ferocious concentration that just went on unremittingly for 2 years, and then the whole house of cards collapsed in an instant. And I didn't have any thought that that was going to happen before it did. So, don't always, let me say it a different way. Give up thinking that things have a way they have to look. Grace could drop on your head in the form of having your path blown up in 1 instant. And you might feel like shit, but that might be the last doorway you have to walk through, and you just didn't know it. I've listened to your talks about all the things you experienced in your path, and I thought, God almighty, for one human being to have to go through that is just, right? But there it is. Don't be afraid of things that look unspiritual or whatever. It's all grist for the mill. Really, seriously. I mean, if you get serious enough about it, everything, every instant is grist for the mill. And the last thing I want to say about that is, as most of you have probably heard Joel say 100 times, nothing I did at that last moment of awakening caused anything. I'd heard him say 100 times, it's just grace. And I have absolutely no better word to use for it than that. You can't cause it. Well, like the question a few minutes ago, you can't cause it. Sort of all you can do is blow up the idea that there's a you in there doing anything. And then the rest is just up to God. Gosh, I don't get.
So after you, I mean, this is just for clarification.
I need lots of clarification.
Without being really on practice. After you hit the wall, you paid tremendous attention to your thoughts and sensations, and you always did a reminder to yourself as it passed. That's not me.
Not exactly.
Okay.
I asked myself, is that me? That phenomenon, whether it was a sight, a sound, a sensation, whatever, a thought. It was a really simple question, and again, several people who I've spoken with about this have said, that doesn't quite work for me. And I would say, great, I'm weird, and it's a weird question, and you shouldn't think you should adopt that question, but find your own. The thing that did was it directed my attention to the present moment and whatever was arising in that moment. And when that phenomena vanished, it's like, oh.
Well, you also reframe each of those moments.
How do you mean?
From your normal conditioning, which would think that's me, you reframed it by asking that question.
Well, right. That was the point of the question, was to challenge, well, to inquire, is it true? This belief I have in a self, and I couldn't find something somewhere in here that I could point to specifically and say, well, I think that's me. I just couldn't find it. So it left me with dealing with only what arose, which I think ended up being great because then I didn't have to figure anything out. I mean, something's always arising, right? There's always a sound, a sight, a smell, whatever. You know, a practice I just sort of made up, and I'm sure it's not original. But some years ago, I started paying attention as I was falling asleep with my eyes closed. I would pay attention to sound in the distance, right? Like I'd hear a car go by a couple blocks away. And then I'd pay attention to the sound of like my breath going in and out, or the abdomen moving while breathing. But most especially to other sound, like the sound of breath or like a little ringing in the ears. And I'd ask myself, okay, sound of car out there, ringing in the ear. Where's the boundary? It's just sound. And it's just hearing. And I don't find a boundary. And the more I did it, the more I started to think, this is weird. Why do I arbitrarily say, that's out there and that's not me, but ringing in the ears is me, or mine? Based on what am I drawing that boundary? They're just sound arising and passing both. Did I answer your question? Thanks. Yeah.
And you said that anger fueled you for 2 years. Did it stay with you, or did you tap into it when you needed a boost?
You know, it was with me really strongly for a while, and it did sort of attenuate or slip into the background. But the mindset that went with it, this is sort of the brutal, only this, that didn't go. It's like the visceral emotion was there long enough that it sort of shaped the whole mental outlook. And that was it. Yeah, Jennifer.
Do you feel like, in retrospect, some practices during your path were more supportive of having that ferocity of attention in your last 2 years?
You know, I don't know. So thinking out loud. I often thought of myself as a not very good meditator. You know, get distracted easily, attention doesn't stay for long, fall asleep. God, I had a problem for years. We would talk sometimes about I'm still falling asleep half the time. And yet I knew meditation was vital and that I wasn't going to give it up. And then there'd be retreats where I just have these really profound experiences meditating. So I do think meditation probably played a really important part. I think probably the biggest part it played was in deconstructing significant parts of the way I thought things were. There was a retreat where Joel said, we're going to meditate now, and then partway through the meditation, I'm going to ask Tom to ring the gong. Or no, to hold. I'm going to ring the gong, and Tom's going to hold up another one, a smaller one, right? And when that happens, I want you to look up at the gong, and then we'll talk about it afterwards. So all that happened, and Joel asked everybody to share, and I was the last person to share, and I was kind of reluctant to share because people had talked about a number of experiences they'd had, and some of them sounded pretty cool, and mine wasn't. And at the end, I raised my hand and said, you know, when you said, look at the gong, Joel, I looked up and I didn't know what to do. I mean, I really didn't know what to do because as I looked, I didn't know what the gong was. I saw light over here and a form here and color here. And what part of it was the gong? But those thoughts weren't really going on. What there was confusion. So, you know, Joel later said, that's significant. So a lot, and that was fairly late in the retreat. I think meditation at that point was deconstructing experience to a level where my brain couldn't even really function at that moment in a normal way. So objectively, I'd have to say, yeah, probably decades of meditation probably played a significant part. In the end, certainly, for me, inquiry played a vital role. But that depended on the set of circumstances that I've described, sort of where all the BS was blown away, and I just had this sort of ferocious concentration. Earlier, I think, you know, inquiry hadn't been so powerful for me because I was just sort of floating around. And is this me? Well, I don't know. Let me see. What do I think about that? You know, but when that stuff was all destroyed, it became really different.
How about Tai Chi? You mentioned that you thought that was important for being able to actually experience sensation without the overlay of thought.
For me, that was critically important, I think.
So
because
if you hadn't done the Tai Chi, would you have been able to do this last inquiry?
I don't know, because it didn't happen that way. So I don't know. I mean, intellectually, I could speculate that, well, maybe something else would have led to that, because ultimately meditation did sort of start to reveal it. But the reason I started doing it was because I realized that at that point where I started Tai Chi, I felt like in my meditation I was just rambling around in my head. So at that point, meditation wasn't doing it. I remember a retreat where we did a lot of walking meditation. We'd walk down from the hall to the parking area, and that was really powerful for me. And I think that was another example of the same thing. It's like I needed something visceral, if you will, to capture attention so that attention could notice it's possible to attend to something and not think about it, to just let the experience arise and be whatever it is. Tai Chi did play a really important role for me in that regard. It's not any of the sort of other teachings of Tai Chi about which I can't say much, but this was much more sort of like a musician. You know, you've used often the example of the guitarist, you know, who just went on a riff one day and everybody just was awestruck. It's kind of like that. You just keep doing something over and over until it takes over. And that's something I think we've all talked about so many times, is you go to a place where somehow you just vanish, and whatever it is, the activity just takes over and happens on its own. And you can't cause it because then you're still there doing it. So, I don't know, lots of repetition. And that's one thing too, is we grow up and, by the time you're this age, you've had a lot of repetition of a lot of what you think you are. It may take a lot of repetition to undo that. Yeah.
It sounded to me like it was a teeter-totter of mental stuff, and when you did the Tai Chi, it put you more into the physical realm of the senses and stuff, because you weren't in your head, you were in your body. And then when you did the inquiry, it sounded like being in the moment was sensations more than the thoughts.
At that,
you have a tightness in your tummy and you stop to inquire about it. So it kind of, to me, it sounded like it was a teeter-totter, and doing the Tai Chi and the senses with the inquiry kind of balanced it out.
that may be. I haven't thought about it like that, so I just, but there's definitely the aspect that the one thing forced me to concentrate on sensation. And every time I tried to think, like I'm doing this exercise, push hands with my teacher, and every time I try to think about what's he doing and what am I going to do next.
I've done that. I know what you're talking
Right.
about. Yeah.
By that time, I'm already 5 feet that way.
Yeah.
And that's not a successful way to do that enterprise.
No, it's a good exercise.
Right. But so what I learned, 10 or 50 or 100,000 repetitions later, was you've got to find a way to concentrate and try and follow his instruction, which is just to be soft and pay attention and see what happens.
Pardon what seems an obvious question, but in your inquiry, you're asking everything that's arising, is this me? Was your definition of me, or what was your definition of me? Is your definition of me what is unchanging, what is always present? Could we substitute the word, is this real? How could you look at those things and say, this is not me?
It's a great question. My criteria was, if it's gone and I'm still here, it's not me. And I know that's simplistic, but that's the level I had fallen to. Really, I mean, there was no real sophisticated thought process going on here about things like that. And that's a great question to ask. It's just that in my case, there was one criteria. Awareness is here. Everything else seems to come and go. Is there a clue there? Well, for me to catch the clue, I had to sort of destroy every other answer to that question that revealed itself to be untrue.
I was just curious if dreams ever played a role in your past.
That's another practice that I was just awful at. Dream practice. There are sensory members who are just really good at that, and I listen to them, and I listen to Joel's dream work, and I'm just odd. I'm crap at that. I, for years, haven't slept great, so I often just don't even remember dreams, and so basically no. I wish I could report otherwise, but I can't. Yeah, you had the question?
Yeah, just pure curiosity.
Yeah.
I'm picturing you being so immersed daily, hourly, by the minute, paying attention to your sensations and listening to this inquiry. And Bailey, your name's Bailey, right? Like, did he seem different when he was doing that practice? Like, does one appear sort of distracted, or does one appear more present? I'm just trying to picture you doing that? What does that look like when someone's so tenaciously paying attention and inquiring?
Is that a question for
Yeah,
me?
that's for you.
Well,
I guess.
I definitely noticed that he was intent,
Mm.
but he's always been pretty intent on his path. But that couple years, it was more apparent that he was bringing more focus. And yeah, I mean, there were times where I felt like I might be interfering with what was going on. I mean, we've never really talked about this, but he was so hyper-focused that sometimes he would be a little short with me.
Little. She's being very kind.
Yeah. And he'd actually bring it into our relationship as well and ask me very pointed questions. Because we're both on this, same path. So it was kind of an interesting experience to watch him go through it. We'll talk later.
Look out.
Pure curiosity, trying to imagine what you're describing, what it looks like from the outside.
I will say advertisement for the good guy from the other side is she did notice it after I said when the awakening happened, I said nothing to anybody, her included, for 6-8 weeks. I didn't call Joel. I didn't do anything. Talking to Joel hardly ever even crossed the radar screen. It was just, this is so obvious. How could you possibly miss this? Well, what's the need to even say anything about anything? And then some friends came to stay with us, the Cravens. I know some of you know them. And we started talking one night and talking about spiritual experience and stuff. And one thing led to another. And it sort of came out, the whole story. And Sheila especially said, I think you probably ought to get hold of Joel and let him know. And then I found out last night that behind my back, she actually said something to him before I ever even wrote the letter. Damn. Yeah.
I'm curious if in this process for the last couple of years,
Yeah.
as you got more intent, did you find that at times you kind of went down a dead end or a distraction? Like, for instance, did you find yourself experiencing more bliss
No.
at times?
No. Bliss was not a factor at all. And whatever you're fantasizing about, what that answer might mean, you're probably right. It was miserable some of the time. There was no bliss at all.
I'm just curious because, myself, when my meditation seems to get on track, I'll tend to start feeling more blissful, and that can become a distraction for me. I start expecting that. I think that's
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
So maybe you're fortunate that you didn't.
Well, I do now think that I was fortunate, that it was sort of a mercenary frame of mind.
But did you feel more and more, like on a gradual sense of more of this kind of don't know mind, where? You know
Yeah.
what I mean, Joel talks about don't know mind a lot.
Yeah. I mean, when you get to the point where absolutely nothing is answering the question, it's just like, what the hell? What am I? And you ask me now, what am I? I have no clue. But it's okay. There's nobody here anyway to own it, so. Yeah.
David, when you say not bliss, it reminds me of kenosis. And is that part of your experience for the awakening?
We've talked about this some, and sometimes I think it was sort of a 2-year protracted kenosis, nails driven in for 2 years or something. I would actually say, if you're going to be sort of technical the way Joel writes and talks about it, the kenosis was like that instant between the two steps, like when your head hit the pillow and just before, But in a very real way, at least for me at that point, from where I'd come from, it was a burning down of an awful lot of stuff. So in some ways, yeah, with respect to that quality.
See, it sounds like you had a really one-pointed focus.
Yeah.
During those 2 years, did you find the worldly things distracting you? The death of your mother, politics?
Not much.
issues?
I mean, I run elections in the county where I live. That's a very distracting thing.
Yeah.
Never more so than now. And so there were things that required my attention, and I had to give them my attention. I suppose, ironically, I sort of had more attention to give them because it just shifted. But then when that was over, it sort of went back. And it might have just been, in any given moment, picking one thing.
To be able to focus on something.
Like that sound. And then one sensation. And it's like each one just did its little bit of eroding away any concept that anything was ever going to answer that question. But I never thought, and this is interesting, I never thought about it that way as it was going on.
Was this really different for you?
Yes.
To be that way than
Yes.
5 years ago?
Yes, it was. And this was another thing that I consider grace, because that running into the wall moment, I was great. I was walking on the beach. I was having a good time. I loved the beach. I loved this piece of writing. I was saying it, and then you're toast, boy.
You didn't love it so much anymore, huh?
No. And it's still one of my all-time favorite teachings, because for me, it's one of the most succinct pointing instructions that I know of. Because it's pointing to how we live every instant of our life. And just saying, look, this is it. It's already here. So what are you doing?
I just have to say one thing here, because the teaching here is not completely original. It's an adaptation of a Dzogchen teaching. And I've just updated for our culture and time and place. So instead of an instruction like, when you think of 100 yaks and burning desire arises, notice it. You know what? I never felt a burning desire for 100 yaks. In fact, if 100 yaks showed up, I'd say, get them out of here. So it's not some sort of magic original teaching with me. So, but it is updated, and it's put hopefully into words that will speak to someone from this culture, this time and place.
Which is why I signed up in the first place, right?
Well, that's true.
Because,
yes.
Yeah, because that's what I was looking for. Somebody that could put it to me in a way that I could feel organically, if you will. Yeah, so.
Okay, I think we should bring the formal part of the evening to a close here, unless somebody has a burning question they didn't get a chance to ask and really needs to ask them now.
Would you consider teaching at a Cloud Mountain retreat?
Sure, I'd consider it if I was asked. Yeah, I can't necessarily guarantee. One of the things that became part of that 3 or 4 year block of time I talked about, where I suddenly couldn't go on retreat, that started with my mother, my work shifted and the retreat schedule shifted a little bit closer to election day in November. That was one of the things I couldn't get around. So it's just going to depend on my schedule and stuff. I'm still working, and I still need to work. So, but yes, I would.
In fact, let me ask you this. Are you open to communicating with people, like through email or something?
Yes.
So if any of you want to, communicate with Dave, why don't you afterwards here ask for his email and talk about when, what's how you go about that, and
Okay, yeah.
go from there. Do we think he's going to be a good teacher? Yeah. Poor guy. Poor guy.
Oh, well.
Now you're really in for it.
Already is.
Okay. So as I said, that we as a board will talk about, what sort of formal relationship we might have. It may just be informal, like our relationship with Andrea down at Lone Pine or in Bishop. But in any case, he's willing to teach, and the only way that happens is people ask him questions. So it's up to you. And if you know anybody in that area, turn them on to him, and we'll see how it goes. All right? Thanks so much for coming down. We really,
Thank you
really
for inviting
appreciate
me.
it. And yes, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having, for us.